2020 has been a year everyone would like to forget. Businesses are shutting down, people are getting left without jobs, and people are falling ill left and right. The economy has also seen its worst decline since the Great Depression. As a non-essential business, amusement parks have been hit hard as well. A lot of parks never opened this year, with strict COVID reopening guidelines from some states, and even the ones who did open were limiting capacity and trying their best to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Some were much better than others, and today, I wanted to look back at all the parks I visited and see who handled the pandemic the best and who was the worst. For this video, I have 4 separate categories to break this down: reservations, masks, social distancing, and other safety measures to see what all parks were doing in 2020. Let's start with Magic Springs in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The only amusement park in Arkansas was not the most enjoyable experience I've ever had at a park, and that included how they handled COVID. Reservations, not required, though they did encourage purchasing parking tickets and admission tickets online. Masks, only required in indoor, dining, and retail areas, although guests weren't even following that rule. I believe I saw about 50% of employees wearing masks on my visit to the park on opening day, but they were mostly in these indoor dining and retail centers. Social distancing. Surprisingly, guests were paying attention to the markers in the queue lines and spreading out. The staff really didn't do much to enforce this issue, other than to space out the trains. Other measures. They were sanitizing your hands prior to each ride, and they also sanitized the trains after every hour. So for their final grade, I'm going to give the employees a D and the guests a D-. Silver Dollar City is my home park, and I went here quite often in 2020. They did a much better job than Magic Springs, but how good were they? Reservations, initially required, but since attendance was so low anyways, they ditched that idea, and they weren't required through October 31st. However, for an old-time Christmas, they will require them again, but only for select days, like Saturdays and peak attendance days. Masks. Silver Dollar City required masks to be worn throughout the park, except when eating or drinking and while on the water rides. Employees did a good job making sure everyone had their masks on properly, but guests tried to get away with not wearing them properly as much as possible. Social distancing. There were markers on the ground, but literally no one was paying attention to them in the queue lines. It got really annoying waiting in line for rides and having someone breathing down your neck. The park reminded people to spread out, but they weren't overly strict about it. Other measures. They performed temperature screenings, but they used the laser gun to point at your head. And they were also sanitizing your hands prior to every ride and sanitized the trains every hour. So for final grade, I'll give the employees an A-, but the guests a C-. Adventureland, much like Magic Springs, had very loose restrictions given the states that they're in. Iowa and Arkansas had some of the most relaxed COVID restrictions, as neither state had a stay-at-home order. Reservations were not required. Masks also not required, although most staff members had one on, but only about 5% of the guests wore a mask, which that included myself. Social distancing. They were spacing out trains, but the guests were not spacing out in queue lines, even worse than Silver Dollar City. Other measures. They sanitized trains every hour, but they really did the bare minimum of safety precautions here. So for a final score, I'll give the employees a C- and the guests an F. Six Flags St. Louis is one of 5 Six Flags parks that I visited in 2020. And most everything I can say here can apply to the other 4 Six Flags parks I visited. However, there were a few differences between each park, so let's start with St. Louis. Reservations. Every Six Flags park requires reservations to get into their parks. At least the reservation system is easy to use. Masks. Masks are required, and employees did their best to make sure everyone wore their mask properly. Social distancing. The employees weren't as strict with this issue here as they were at other Six Flags parks, but they also weren't bad either. Other measures. The temperature screening method is easy. You just enter the tent and don't even realize you're getting your temperature taken with their thermal screening system. Six Flags St. Louis also sanitized each train after every hour. So for a final score, I'll give the employees an A- and the guests a C+ for St. Louis. Silver Dollar City's sister park, Dollywood, was even better than Silver Dollar City with their safety measures, at least from my experience. Reservations. They are required for single-day ticket holders and pass holders. The only exception I found is that since I have a Silver Dollar City season pass, I'm able to get a half-price discount on a one-day admission, so I was able to purchase a ticket at the gate. Masks. They were required, and employees did their best to make sure everyone had their mask on properly. Social distancing. Dollywood did a good job making sure people were spacing out in the queue lines and even on the main paths, which is very hard. Other measures. They do have the same laser gun temperature screening system as their sister park, and I do much prefer the tents at Six Flags parks. They were also sanitizing trains after every hour. So for a final score for Dollywood, I'll give the employees an A- and the guests a B-. So since I visited 5 different Six Flags parks, I won't bore you with every entry, so I'll just run through the rest of them real quickly here. Six Flags Over Georgia was very strict with social distancing, but was also making sure everyone had their masks on properly. Six Flags Over Texas stopped a train on Titan to tell a guest to pull up their mask, so it's clear that they took that issue seriously as well. And the same can be said for Fiesta Texas, but they had an employee in Wonder Woman's line telling people where to stand, which shows their commitment to safety as well. They also didn't accept cash, which I won't get into my opinion about that. If you really want to know, leave a comment below. Frontier City was probably the worst Six Flags park about COVID safety, and the only reason I say that is they didn't bother to space out the trains, but at least the employees made sure everyone had masks on, so that made me feel safer personally. So for a final score for Over Georgia, employees get an A and the guests a C+. Over Texas, the employees get an A and the guests get a B. Fiesta Texas, employees an A and the guests a C, and that's because not very many guests were social distancing in the queues because they had someone telling people where to stand. Frontier City, both the employees and the guests get a B-. Next on the hot seat is Holiday World, and I visited during Hollywood Nights, and good lord, it was crowded. Reservations were not required for park entry, but they were needed for the backstage tours of Voyage and Thunderbird. Masks, required for main pathways and in indoor places, but only after the state mandated them. Initially, they weren't required. All employees and about 80% of park guests had masks on during the afternoon, but basically all coaster enthusiasts during the ERT wore masks. Social distancing. The midways were very crowded, so it was next to impossible, but at least people were trying to spread out in the queue lines. Other safety measures. Sanitizing rides every hour, and their virtual queue system, which I was not a fan of because you couldn't reserve more than one ride at a time. So for a final score, I'll give the employees a B+, the general public a B-, but I will give the coaster enthusiasts an A because every single one of them, it seemed like that I came across, was wearing a mask. Kentucky Kingdom was another park I visited for a big coaster enthusiasts event. Theirs called Keys to the Kingdom, and it was a fun time. Reservations, not required. Masks were also not required except for park entry and in places you couldn't maintain a 6-foot distance. Social distancing. It was about a 50-50 shot whether people would be spread out in queue lines. Other safety measures. They unloaded trains 2 rows at a time so people wouldn't crowd the exit path, which I thought was interesting. Plus, they sanitized the trains every hour. So for a final score, I'll give the employees a B and the guests a C+. Indiana Beach got a lot of scrutiny from certain enthusiasts after watching vlogs from the grand reopening of the park. 2 months after they reopened, how did they fare? Reservations were not required. Masks also not required, despite Indiana's state mask mandate. Good job, guys. Social distancing. They had markers on the ground, but were people actually spreading out? No, not really. Other safety measures. They initially did temperature screenings, but I guess since I arrived so late, they didn't bother, which shows how lax they are with safety measures. For a final score, I'll give the employees a D+, but I'm going to give the guests a D-. SeaWorld San Antonio was the only SeaWorld park I visited in 2020, and there were a handful of similarities with the SeaWorld and Six Flags parks, but there were a couple differences as well. Reservations were required. Masks mandatory throughout the park, and employees stopped to train on Steel Eel's lift hill to tell a guest to put his mask on. Social distancing. The park did their best, but guests at the end of the day were simply just not having it. Of other safety measures. Temperature screenings were done very similarly to Six Flags parks, but SeaWorld had cattle pens inside the tent, which was interesting. And they also sanitized trains every hour. For a final score, I'll give the employees an A and the guests a C+. Finally, there were 2 boardwalk parks in Texas that I visited, Kemah Boardwalk and Galveston Island Historic Pleasure Pier. Let's just say they really didn't care honestly at all. Granted, these are parks where you pay per ride, but still, it would have been nice if Pleasure Pier could have enforced their supposed mask policy more strictly, as even though they were technically required, none of the employees seemed to care. Both parks are getting Fs across the board. Sorry, you guys failed my class. So as you can see, a lot of employees did a very good job of trying to contain the spread of COVID-19. And employees did about as much as they possibly can to enforce the rules. Yes, guests tried their best to get away with the rules as much as possible. But at the end of the day, I really do applaud the employees for trying to make theme parks a safe experience in 2020. And to all the guests that tried to break the rules, suck it up. These rules won't last forever. So that's all the parks I visited in the terrible year that was 2020. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments below. And thank you very much for sticking around with me through this long video. If you did enjoy it, please drop a like. And if you haven't yet, definitely consider subscribing. Those are the best ways to show your support for the channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.